Then we have where the bones come together. And this is where we find an awful lot of more stuff than just the bone, all the connective tissues that support us. And we can split bones into three overarching categories. We have fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and then the biggest category are synovial joints. So a fibrous joint is when you've got two bones that are linked with a really tough fibrous connective tissue, almost immovable. In fact, as we get older, they become more immovable. So a really good example of that is the sutures in our skull. So when a baby's born, the skull bones have a little bit of movement in them for several reasons. First of all, to make the process of birth possible, the skull bones, as a baby's being born, can slide around a little bit. Babies are often born with quite weird shaped skulls, and that's because they are designed to move around a little in order to help the process of birth. And then also, as a baby grows, particularly through young childhood, up to the age of about 7 or 8, the brain is expanding rapidly. So if the bones were all fused together, then there wouldn't be space for that to happen. However, once growth has finished, the bones of the skull need to not move around anymore. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to serve that function that we talked about just a minute ago in terms of protecting the brain. So the joints fuse. It is a joint because two bones are coming together, but it is in no way a movable joint. Those are referred to as fibrous joints, so immovable. And the classic place of finding them is the sutures of the skull. Cartilaginous joints are found predominantly in childhood, although there are a couple that continue there throughout our life. And this is when you have bone joined to bone with a bit of cartilage in the middle. So it's not a truly flexible joint in the same way as elbows and knees, for example, but there is a little bit of movement there should it be required. The best example of this is in childhood, when the long bones, the diaphysis, so the long shaft of the bone, is joined to the epiphysis, the lumpy bit at either end, at a cartilaginous joint, and this is to allow the bone to grow and lengthen. Once it's finished, that cartilaginous joint will go and it will all be one bone. But there's a couple of places where we continue to keep our cartilaginous joints. One is where the ribs join the breastbone or the sternum, so up in this region. Your ribs need to be able to move ever so slightly separately from your sternum, because when we take a really deep breath, for example, your ribs sort of flex out the way. You don't want a lot of movement because they need to be there to protect, but they do need to move a little bit. So that's cartilaginous joint. Also, in our spine, there are parts of the spinal column that come together with cartilage. Not the whole thing. It's a slightly different type of joint, but there are parts where you get cartilaginous joints. And then most commonly, we have a synovial joint, a truly movable, flexible joint. Synovial joints now split up into several different categories, which we'll talk about at the moment. But, you know, knees, hips, elbows, a truly movable joint that you would think of. You'll be familiar with the term synovial from when we discussed membranes. One of the learning outcomes for this session is to discuss synovial membranes, but I'm going to leave that to yourselves because we talked about it quite a lot previously, actually when we discussed epithelium, because most joints and most membranes have an element of epithelium, however synovial joints don't. It produces lubrication. But I want you to go and have a read about that, refresh your memory from when we discussed epithelium and membranes, and then we can come back and discuss it in our tutorial session. So, different types of synovial joints then. So there are several. The first one I want to talk about is a ball and socket joint, probably a term that you're quite familiar with, and it is what it says on the tin. One end of a bone will have a lump, rounded lump like a ball, and the other end will have a cup-shaped socket that the ball will fit into. When we talk about one bone moving against another, we use the term articulate or articulation. So from now on, these are the words I'm going to be saying. So what we're looking at in this image here is a shoulder joint. And the head of the humerus, the upper arm bone, has a large rounded extension, a ball on the end. And then within the scapula, which is the shoulder blade, there is a sort of C-shaped cup that the head of the humerus articulates against. A ball and socket joint is a really flexible joint, really wide range of movement. It allows almost 360 degrees of movement, depending on which type of joint it is. But the classic example of a ball and socket joint is a shoulder joint or a hip joint, where the head of the femur fits into the articulating aspect of the pelvis. So that's a ball and socket joint. The next one we want to think about is a hinge joint. Now, as the name suggests, it's a little bit less flexibility in a hinge joint than a ball and socket. If you think about the hinge on a door, it will open and it will close, but it won't like lift up and down. So that's what we're talking about in a hinge joint. So you've got the articulating ends of bones fitting onto the corresponding hinge of the other end of the bone. So it will allow you to move it in one direction and back in the other. And that's what we find in the elbow and also in the knee joint. You can't really, if you twist your arm round, you'll notice that the elbow goes with it. It's the shoulder joint that's circling. The elbow itself will only open and close. Just like the knee, you can rotate your whole leg, but that goes from the hip joint. You can't rotate your lower leg separately to the upper leg. Or if you do, it will cause you quite a bit of damage. So the elbow and the knee are hinge joints. The next one is a little bit more complicated, and it's called a gliding joint. And this actually happens with sort of flat or seismoid bones. And rather than articulating at a set point, they actually slide over the top of each other a little, almost like sort of tectonic plates in the Earth's crust. And you find them in the hands and the feet. And it's the talus bones and the other slightly more complicated bones, but I don't want you to spend a lot of time learning the names of all these tiny little bones. But the bones that are not the ankle itself, but further down, and similarly in your hand, just below the wrist. And they sort of rub over the top of each other slightly and glide together. And that's referred to as a gliding joint. Next we have a pivot joint. And on a pivot joint, you can swivel. So the best example of that is where your head joins your neck. So the top of the vertebral column, where it meets with the base of the skull. And this is all to do with ligaments, because it's not, you would think perhaps a pivot joint might be like a ball and socket type arrangement, but it's not, because that would allow too much movement. So basically you have loops of ligaments that hold one bone to another and allow you to swivel about, but not move around excessively. A condyloid joint, it sounds like an unusual name, but a condyloid joint involves a condyle. And a condyle is a projection from bone, sort of like a apple on a stick type situation. And you have a condyle in your jaw, so your temporal mandibular joint, The mandible has an extension here, which has a lump on the end, and then it fits into a socket, articulates into that socket. And you have that between the mandible and the temporal bone, hence why it's referred to as the temporal mandibular joint. Now, it's a little bit complicated, the TMJ, because it can also be referred to as a sliding and a hinge joint, but without complicating things too much at the moment, we'll refer to it as a condyloid joint because it has a condyle. And the last type of synovial joint is a saddle joint. And a saddle joint is where a bone sort of wraps itself over on top of another bone, just like you would find a saddle on a horse. So it sort of wraps over. Your thumb is a saddle joint. It allows an elliptical movement, and it's also what means that the saddle joint, is what allows you to be able to touch all the ends of all your fingers with your thumb. The other fingers are not saddle joints. That's why you can't touch the end of, or easily touch the end of, say, your third finger or your ring finger with your first finger, because it's a different type of joint. So the thumb joint, which is also referred to as the CNC joint, as you can see here, is a saddle joint. So for more information on joints, you can continue on reading the information in Ross and Wilson. I asked you in your essential reading to read up to page 411. From there, you'll find information about joints and about synovial membranes, and that goes up to page 420, after which I start talking about skeletal muscle, which you should already be quite familiar with.